You're listening to episode 61 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Tobias Cann joins us to speak about mindfulness, spirituality, and well-being education in schools with his international work. Mindfulness in schools is growing by leaps and bounds all over the world, from the .B program in the UK to Mindful Schools in the US, and a host of other programs are introducing and growing contemplative practice for kids. What does the journey look like from the inside as a teacher? Toby Cann is a teacher of well-being and former director of student well-being for the GEMS group. He is a contributor to the International Baccalaureate's Social and Emotional Learning Committee and the 2020 Health Initiative in the UK. He is a member of the European Network for Social and Emotional Competencies and leads the Character Competency for Ecolint's 21st Century program in Geneva. Toby is currently an MA student of theology at the University of Bristol and has recently returned from Bhutan as a participant at the Gross National Happiness Conference in Paro. His interests lie in alternative educational paradigms, political literacy, and contemplative educational practice. He lives in Frome, Somerset. Our guest today is Tobias Cann. Toby, welcome to the podcast. Very glad you're here.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me.
It's been a long time coming. For the listeners of the podcast, Toby and I have been emailing for quite some time, and I'm just delighted to get a chance to finally meet him and speak with him. So, Toby, let's give the listeners a chance to get to know you as well. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm a Brit. I was born in London in the 70s, and I am a school teacher by trade. I've been involved in education and in schools since I was a little boy. In fact, my dad was a headmaster of a school in England, and I've been kind of in and out of schools since 3 years old. My background was very much in the private sector. As a kid, I was educated in, I don't know if all your listeners would be aware, but we have a kind of a private and a public sector or a state school system in the UK. And so those of us that were able to, or privileged enough to attend private schools, had a kind of slightly different and often a boarding or residential schools experience. I went through quite a strong Protestant private school education from a young age until I graduated school and went off to become a student at university. And there I trained in social policy and I trained to become a youth worker. I actually trained with the YMCA. And I was working in further education colleges, which was the complete opposite of the spectrum from this rather privileged private world that I had come from. And I found myself in the streets of Newcastle and Sunderland, working with kids who were disengaged with their learning environments. And this was a bit of a challenge to me. These were two worlds that had kind of collided. And I suddenly realized the extent to the privilege I'd had before and became really interested in education. I then went on to train to teach in London and became what was at the time called a citizenship teaching program at the University of Goldsmiths, where we were teaching what we would describe as political literacy. a form of engagement in the political system. We were getting kids into classes for an hour a week and trying to get them to be interested in how they could become involved in community and democratic decision making. And I was kind of set for a fairly straightforward path in working in inner city schools. In North London, I was at Holloway. And then one day I got a phone call from a school in Prague who were looking for someone to come and help develop a new sort of international school. And I was kind of intrigued, actually. I'd spent 3 years working in state schools in England. And I had this sort of overwhelming feeling that we weren't really doing enough for our students, that the existing paradigm of education, the very narrative-based classroom settings that young people were experiencing, they weren't engaged in it. No matter what wonderful, exciting curriculum we presented, the system, I felt, was letting down the kids. So I spoke with these guys in Prague. They were talking about a very different model of education. They wanted to bring in kids in a boarding school setting. They wanted to have a mixture of fee-paying and private school kids, if you like. And then the majority would have come from foster care, from low-level income families who really wanted to try and do something by putting their kids in an alternative setting. And perhaps rather naively, I decided it was a good idea. So I moved. I took my then girlfriend, became my wife, and we moved to Prague. And for 2 years, we helped set up this boarding school, which was an extraordinary experience. But what we really wanted to do was create the conditions by which kids could have an alternative learning experience. So it wasn't just going to be what I would call a kind of normal paradigm school. It was trying to promote certain values and certain ethics in the education program that went well beyond what you'd get from a normal school. And that required us to have different relationships with the kids. You know, we wanted young people to develop really meaningful relationships with the adults. And by that, I mean that, you know, those sort of conventional student teacher roles, that actually you could do something with that to allow communication to happen on a more human scale. So a lot of the teachers lived on site. It was a 24/7 job. We trained extensively colleagues into, you know, you have to develop really strong professional boundaries with this kind of work. But it meant that also we were putting an emphasis on like role modeling and coaching of these young people. The kind of belief that a lot of the education didn't just happen in the classroom, but actually happened outside of it. And it was relentless and exhausting and fascinating work. And after 2 and a bit years, I kind of felt that I needed to do something new and moved back to the UK. And within 6 months, I was invited to interview at another international school who were trying to set up a well-being program for their young people. That was 10 years ago now, and I've been involved in the international school's well-being programs ever since.
So tell us more about that. I think it's director of student well-being at that school in Switzerland. And you talked about what led us to that. You've returned from that. That was only going to be a few years, and it stretched into 10. So clearly there is some staying power there. What was that experience like? What was the program? What did you learn?
Well, initially I was very lucky to be based in Paris. The International School of Paris is an amazing little, I say little, it's sort of, I think it's now 700 kids, international school, very close to the Eiffel Tower, in a beautiful setting with a real mix of young people. And I was brought in essentially to teach a well-being curriculum, which was going to be an hour a week with these young people that was a kind of foil to their traditional learning experiences. And I was presented with a curriculum which was fabulous. You know, it was a really thorough mixture of all the kinds of things that young people might need in a kind of toolbox to experience their lives and to prepare them for the future. And so I'm talking about things like learning about drugs education or sexual health or safe using of computers and the internet and so on. It really, really, you know, very thorough and very relevant material. And after about a couple of years of this, I realized that we were experiencing all the kinds of problems that the curriculum was meant to deal with. In other words, no matter how many hours we would talk about using social media safely, I would still have young people behaving inappropriately with social media. I'd be an extremely wealthy man if I knew how to resolve that with a curriculum. And so I was left in this slightly tricky situation thinking, here I am advocating this curriculum, but at the same time, it's not necessarily yielding the results that perhaps it should. So I lent quite heavily on that mentoring coaching program that we'd established in the UK and in Prague. And we trained up a group of teachers to work one-to-one with young people who were, for various reasons, struggling to engage in their learning. But again, I got that feeling it wasn't enough. So I started to look around for something that I think would go deeper. And by deeper, I meant would go to the very core of what being a human is about. And initially, I thought I found my answer with a group of people called the Human Givens Institute. And they were a group of psychologists and therapists who had established a practice based around what they called the emotional needs audit. And they'd outlined, if I should get this right because I used it so long, 9 different indicators for how happy you were and to what extent that would be able to, you'd be able to address certain things if those indicators were or were not met. So, for example, being involved in a community and having a sense of being involved in a group of people who shared similar interests. They argued that if of these 9 indicators, if sort of 3 or 4 of them were lacking in your life, then you'd probably struggle, and this might manifest in certain risky choice behaviors or areas where you'd feel unhappy and, you weren't having your emotional needs met. And this model I was kind of really excited about, and I remain quite an advocate of the Human Givens Emotional Needs Audit. It provided this sort of tool that young people could easily, well, they wouldn't necessarily, memorize the tool, but they could see what things were they doing, what areas were they lacking in that might extend to all of those things we spoke about before. I mean, to put it another way, Ted, I don't think I could have answered the requirements of families struggling with social media. I remember a mum coming and asking me, how do I get my son to stop using the computer so much? What can I do to reduce the impact of my daughter sharing photographs of herself with friends that are slightly promiscuous or slightly risky? What are the kind of things, and they would turn to the school, what are you doing to help our kids in this area? And I realized that actually what we were talking about was not necessarily the new electronic device, whatever it might be. We were actually talking about a kind of deeper ethical and philosophical understanding of what it requires to be a good human in this very difficult techno landscape. And again, it came with the sort of the drugs now conversation that we were having. It's not possible, I don't think, for a teacher to keep up with the plethora of new psychoactive substances that are available that kids can use and buy online and do all sorts of things with. I'm sorry if I'm frightening any of your parents who are listening, but what it comes down to again is certain choices and certain values that you could use in any of these decision-making processes. And I got the feeling throughout this that something was lacking, something was missing. And this sort of sense happened about the time when I was very aware that a woman that I'd grown up with, my grandmother, who'd looked after us for a while, she was 98. The doctor said she didn't have long to go. And I didn't really have a sort of, how can I put it, a kind of spiritual literacy, if you like, to cope with this. Despite my upbringing in my school life and my family, like most of the young people of my generation, I think I sort of rejected Christianity. I was quite a socialist, and I definitely believed that, religion was the root of all evil. But I wasn't really prepared for what I was about to experience, which was the death of a loved one. In fact, Ted, I don't know if you remember, but I actually wrote to you at the time and said, here's a signpost. where do I go? And your recommendation was Pema Chodron's When Things Fall Apart. And this book that I ordered on Amazon arrived, and it looked scarily Buddhist. And I thought, oh, I'm not a Buddhist. I don't know what that is. I shouldn't probably read this. I had been listening to secular Buddhist podcasts. I thought I probably ought to try some meditation, some mindfulness. I was living in Paris. I went to the Bois de Vincennes, which is a beautiful park on the east side of the city, has a Tibetan temple. And it's an incredible structure. It sort of houses the largest golden Buddha in Europe. And it's a very peaceful and poetic place. I recommend it as a trip out for anybody who's in Paris and not sure what to do. And I got there and didn't really know who to speak to or where to go. And I kind of came away from that thinking, no, I'm not really a Buddhist, so I shouldn't really be doing this. At about that time, I think you must have interviewed someone. I think it might have been Andy Puddicombe from Headspace.
Andy Puddicombe.
Yeah. And so I kind of started to explore, what a secular version of mindfulness might be, and how that might be appropriate to use in a school setting. And I found myself, in a very privileged way, able to find what we call PD in the UK and the international schools, professional development opportunities. And I said to my boss, look, there's a University of Bangor in North Wales are putting on a mindfulness taster session for teachers. Perhaps I could go along and find out what this is all about. So I went over and I spent 3 days in what turned out to be the most fabulous setting, learning really about this practice and what we could use. And at the training, and I think as is always the way, you meet people who during the gaps between the training who offer as much, if not more, than the training itself. Those guys who provide you with a tip or a signpost or why don't you look at this? Why don't you try that? And I think that what I felt at the time was that perhaps mindfulness could be that kind of compass that young people could use to make informed decisions in whatever arena they find themselves in. That they might have a mindful moment or a space between their stimulus and response. And I think it's right. I think that the mindful practice that I established with the young people in Paris was able to really give them a chance to make informed decisions. Not always, but something in it lent itself to that kind of spiritual literacy that I think we removed from schools in the 70s and 80s in the UK because we wanted to make a distinction between kind of the religious pastoral care and the more modern kind of well-being that we wanted for young people. So towards the end of that period, I was approached to consider a job in Switzerland as the director of student well-being at a brand new school in Switzerland. And I have to say that the opportunity was really exciting. It was a blank canvas. It seemed like the third time I'd been presented with a blank canvas. What could you do in a school that would be at the cutting edge of well-being in education? And again, I thought I'd better go for it. So I moved my family to Switzerland, just between Geneva and Lausanne, and we embarked on this really exciting program of well-being. In this position, I was actually a member of senior leadership. So if you can imagine how schools normally operate, is you have your vice principals and your principal and maybe curriculum coordinators. But I was in that mix too. So every decision the school made had a well-being emphasis within its decision-making process. And the question really that I was asking was, is this decision that we're making in the best interests of our young people? From what we're feeding them at lunchtimes to what we're teaching them during the day to the hours which the school should run from, I was there. And this is quite an extraordinary thing for schools to do. It's not cheap, actually, to have this kind of emphasis. And I felt there that mindfulness education should play a prominent in the school life of the kids. And I got involved with another program who provided a very comprehensive curriculum for young people, both in the primary and the secondary school of this new school. And we adopted that model, and it gathered a lot of interest from the Swiss. This isn't something that the Swiss education system was aware of it. Pleine conscience, which is the sort of the direct translation of mindfulness, according to a lot of folk I spoke to, sounds a little bit hippie. And they kind of were like slightly wary of that. But the Swiss National Radio came to interview the kids. We developed a kind of conference on mindfulness in the school. And we really sort of heralded it and represented mindfulness on a national scale for the 2 years that I was there. And that school continues to have that focus to this day. But towards the end of my time there, I just got the feeling, and I think maybe this is something that you and I have spoken about, and perhaps your listeners are aware of too, that again, we were missing something from this mindfulness movement. When I trained with the program that we finally adopted in the school, I remember thinking that they were very keen to remove any notion of Buddhism from the mindfulness programs. It's funny that we were talking about the bell, that don't use a round bell, use a chime bar, it was told to us. Don't talk about Buddhism if you can possibly help it, but do reference Thich Nhat Hanh's work in the bibliography. All this kind of stuff. And I went to see John Kabat-Zinn speak at a friend's house in London, and he was amazing. And I've just got the feeling that something was missing from this conversation. And I'm not keen on duping young people into thinking that something is secular when in fact it isn't always. There is something terribly useful about mindfulness. But I didn't know enough about its provenance. I felt that I was lacking in a deeper understanding of it. And so I wrote to Rupert Gethin, who is he's a kind of, I expect you would describe him as a world leader. I'm sure he'll be furious at me describing him in that way, of Buddhist academics at the University of Bristol. And they had a master's program, which fascinated me because it was a Buddhist studies program. And I said, could I do this master's, part-time, from Switzerland? And they said, in theory, it's a fine idea, but you've got to be here every Monday afternoon from 2 to 4 in Bristol. And I said, I can't do that. But at the end of last calendar year, I took the decision that actually maybe it's time that I step out of the teaching classroom and spend a bit of time with education. I know it sounds a sort of bit of a paradox, really, but I just felt that, the sort of frontline chalk face work that I was doing in the classroom, I didn't have enough time to invest in these kind of questions and areas. I couldn't answer them. When the young people that I was working with were saying, well, isn't this Buddhist if it's meditation? I said, no, it's not Buddhist. It's mindfulness, and it's here's the neuro la da 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 XYZ that will support this practice. I had, very, very insightful young people who said, we want to know more about that, Toby. We want to know more about, how it's moved from one to the other. So I decided that I would quit teaching and step into the unknown. And my family and I moved back to Somerset, the West Country, and I became a part-time student of the master's program. And this has been an extraordinary learning curve for me. At the same time, I was fortunate to be asked to work with a number of schools who want to do more well-being in their education settings. These are schools that not only private, but actually state schools as well, who are saying, we understand that there's something happening. There's a sort of change in the requests from our families and our kids. They want a kind of deeper, more thoughtful, more interconnected experience. And they're calling it well-being, and sometimes they're calling it mindfulness. But they want something beyond what is just happening in the classroom. This kind of traditional measure of student success isn't enough. That's not to say it's not important. It's just that the discerning parents want more. Yes, they want the grades. They want the portfolio of, the fabulous grades for their young people, and the young people too. But there's something missing from that experience. And that's brought me back to that experience that I felt at Holloway, years and years ago. And so I now find myself on my part-time master's course, working with various schools, who push me all the time saying, no, that's boring. That's not enough. What would you do? What could you do if you had the kind of steering wheel here? Where would you take this learning experience for kids? And so now I'm in this position, this very fortunate position really, where I'm working with a couple of schools, actually a couple of businesses, and a council, like a local town council, who are saying, what is this well-being stuff of which people are speaking of? How do we get some? What should we be doing? So that sort of brings me up to date, really. I think that these experiences, what I get the feeling of is people tend to know what it is that they should be doing anyway. They just often need to be reminded or kind of gently nudged into their own research and their own work on it. I suppose what I'm coming back to is this idea that someone pointed out to me this guy who they said, Toby, you'd love this man. He's a really interesting bloke. He's a guy called Stephen Jenkinson. Stephen Jenkinson he calls himself, he was the head of palliative care in Canada, or one of the Canadian sort of health authorities. And he has this very strong, kind of narrative way of speaking and talking and working with care workers and individual clients. And he wrote a book called Die Wise, which spoke to the kind of existential questions that I think a lot of adults and I dare say a lot of young people have. And his work under the kind of auspices of a program called Orphan Wisdom is to kind of try to address what he thinks are the kind of missing parts to human existence, which is to address our mortality. What does that mean? How does it look? What are we going to do about it? How are we going to prepare our young people for it? Why are we doing such a terrific job of ignoring it in modern Western society? And what impact is that having on people? And I have to say that he really challenged me. Those feelings when you listen and read someone and you think, oh, that's absolutely dreadful. I can't bear it. But it just stays in your head and you can't shake it. And then you have to ask, really why? And I think that his work has really sort of prompted me to think about this with the schools and people I'm working with. What is it that is kind of that we're ignoring or missing, that we're kind of often, I think we're often swapping those questions for quite a lot of consumption or material sort of wealth that we think is the thing that we need the most. But actually, it quite often is the opposite. So I was really lucky this year. I mean, I have to say, a life-changing experience that I had seen that the Bhutanese government were inviting people to a conference on gross national happiness in Bhutan. Ted, I am the worst flyer you have ever met. And Bhutan International Airport is the sort of the scariest airport in the world. So I tentatively wrote to them and said I'd like to come. And they said, great, come, get on the flight and meet us here on such and such a date. I thought, it's just no way I can do it. I spoke to my wife who said, you're an idiot. You've been invited to Bhutan. You've got to go. So I spoke with various people and I realized, if I really am someone who subscribes to these kind of things, I can't say no. So I flew to Paro Airport and spent 11 days in Bhutan speaking about Buddhism, speaking about the spiritual education programs they provide there, talking about gross national happiness, and just came away from it realizing how much I have learned from this tiny, small little Himalayan country, tucked up between India and China. But one of the things that really stood out for me was their mortality is present throughout the landscape. Literally a spiritual landscape. Everywhere you look, there are these collections of white flags. White prayer flags. I think there's the number 108 that repeats itself everywhere in sort of Buddhist cosmology. But these flags are present wherever you look. And they are to remind the Bhutanese of the passing of their own lives and of their loved ones. Interestingly, there are no individual graveyards, or everyone is cremated, and you don't have your own sort of place to honour, your mother or your family or whoever it is death. It's a shared communal experience that everywhere you look. And that's radically transformative, actually, in the existence of the Bhutanese. They think of themselves, obviously, there's a very limited, this is a Vajrayanan Buddhist country. They're not there thinking about their own egos or their own selves. This is a sense of communal living that is present every time they open their windows of their bedrooms. They see these flags and they're reminded of it. And I thought, we could learn a hell of a lot from this type of sort of consciousness and thinking. How can we provide those reflections for our young people? So one of the pieces of work that I'm looking at with students in the UK and in the schools I'm working with is, to what extent could this, which seems like quite a sort of morbid and melancholy topic, be something that we could talk about, maybe from a kind of anthropological perspective, but also from a spiritual and, dare I say, existential perspective. And so I'm beginning to see these links between the international schools world. There's a lot of work going on in character education, resilience, compassion training. I'm sure you've seen lots of compassion training. How can we bring these together so that they don't seem slightly hackneyed and crowbarred into the teaching landscape or the experience of young people? And how might they provide schools, even businesses, with a chance to reflect on their own, dare I say, spiritual space within the day and quotidian of the institutions that I'm working with. And I thought that I would be met with wild and, sort of delirious refusal. People just say, this is absolutely crazy. What are you talking about? You can't bring this into our worlds. And quite the opposite is happening.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about, we have a few things to unpack with this. Yeah. One of the questions that I wanted to go into and explore with you is, what do you want to see happen in the field? Is there a field?
I'm quite often asked by folk to describe well-being. What's well-being in education? Who should we be speaking to? And could you give us like an A4 handout or a single slide on a PowerPoint? I don't know if there is a field. I don't know if you ever use the sort of Google trend analytics, but you can see how certain words and certain phrases suddenly explode on the graph. You know this thing where you read how many times globally people are searching for a certain word. So, for example, I think if you'd have gone back into the early 1990s, you'd see mindfulness as a kind of tiny little, search. And then boom, it's exploded in the last, even 5-7 years, I suspect. And it's now a kind of thing. So well-being in education is a similar explosion. People are seeking it. And where we were in the 70s and 60s in the UK, and I'm speaking really only from my kind of UK context, a lot of that territory was governed and managed by a pastoral sensibility. And pastoral really spoke to Christian values and ethos within the school day. And as that was kind of removed, it was replaced with pastoral care, which looks a bit like religion, but it isn't. And it's very keen to establish itself as being a non sort of, it's like a secular practice. What I feel is that one of the, you might differ and perhaps your listeners completely disagree, but one of the things that I think mindfulness has brought back into schools is this slightly peculiar and perhaps unexplainable experience, transformative experience, I think, of that young people have when they experience a kind of strong silence in their school days. You know, this moment where they sit together, and you know this as much as I do, and I've done lead trainings for all kinds of folk. How often is it that you have someone having an emotional response to silence? Tears. I'm thinking of several occasions where we've sat together just for a minute or so, and a colleague or a parent or not necessarily a young person has responded to that silence by crying or just having an emotional outburst afterwards and saying, you know what, that was really profound for me. So I think that the area of well-being that is beginning to emerge looks to me to be an area which is at once kind of philosophical and perhaps even a exploration of possibly religion and spirituality. I know that there's bound to be people who don't agree with me and who think it should definitely not go that way, but or perhaps, you know, don't see that happening at all. But I think it was you again. I hold you responsible for lots of my shall I call them conversations with my wife about how much I spend on Amazon. Alex Pang, the distraction addiction, was that one of your, possibly?
Not one of mine, although I'm
not one of yours. So he wrote this fabulous book about computer use and adults, and he spoke a lot about this idea of modern technology and how it's impacting young people. It's an amazing book, and I recommend it to anybody who's working with young people and reducing screen time or even themselves. But he speaks about this as well. Contemplation. What does it really mean to have these moments of contemplation? How do we encourage them? What do we do in our daily lives? And where are we having them already? And I get the feeling that well-being is going to move down into a kind of somewhere married between the technological landscape and this, I'm loath to call it a spiritual landscape. Because I get invited, I'm now getting invited to do talks. I was at the Leeds Holistic Education Conference in the UK. And at the Holistic Education Conference, we have, you know, the full spectrum of people who are working in holistic education, be it from working with sort of cranial massage right through to people working in schools doing mindfulness meditation practice. I'm going to Kent in January to the Transformative Experience Conference, which again is you know, looking at all kinds of different areas in well-being. But you see this kind of this full spectrum, you know, of people who are under the umbrella. I'm fascinated by this emerging technological landscape. I think that, well, it's one of the reasons why you and I are talking now, right? There wasn't a Sangha present in my rural village where I lived in Switzerland. There wasn't one that I could access that was speaking in English when I was living in Paris. But I got online, I Googled stuff. I was thinking, I'm interested in, you know, secular Buddhism. Lo and behold, the Secular Buddhist Association. I find myself listening to Jack Cornfield, other folk who have, you know, really interesting podcasts. I'm sure you do the same. And a part of me knows, I don't want this virtual experience to happen. But I'm also sensing that it's very much at the forefront of the young people I'm working with lives. And why would I reject that? If I'm able to have this rich experience of you know, reading and listening and watching, that's really informed my life. And by the way, when I do my mindfulness practice, which I do, and I'm not always very good, but I try as hard as I can to be a good practitioner. I would use the insight timer. Again, something that I was aware from your podcast, and that's been a hugely helpful guide for me. I do think that I respond better when I'm on retreat, and I go on retreats and I meditate with other actual present human beings. But, you know, I think we would sort of reject some of this technology at our peril. when in fact we should embrace it. I'm sure you've seen the new technology with people who can attach their own sort of personal EEG readers onto their heads as they meditate. And the Fitbit sort of technology where you can measure your pulse when you run, and these things could actually promote well-being on a physical level. I think we have to really explore that, and I feel that this is a space that we should embrace, because I think that's the way that we can really get people on board to navigate their own journeys. I don't believe it's my job or anybody else's really to insist on really any of this stuff, actually. The conscript meditation class never works as well for me as the voluntary one, right?
Right. And a phrase you just used, navigating their own journeys. I want to use that as a way for us to open up something that you'd been referring to as you're speaking about this spirituality, that it was sort of purged from the school systems in the UK, in particular in your experience, and there's separation of church and state supposedly here in the United States. And there's an interest in not going into the religious sphere in education, in school systems. And so what your experience was that there was something lacking, that there was an experience, part of your aspect of your life that wasn't really there. And one of the things that I see happen sometimes is there's a gap of some kind for a human need. It's a normal human need. It's not exclusive purview of one ideological stance over another. It's a human need for that which emotionally, physically, mentally moves us and transforms us. And we're used to that being within a context of religion or spirituality. And again, those terms are a little challenging. They're not exact. And so when there's that gap, that vacuum, we tend to fill it perhaps with something else. And mindfulness is sometimes sucked into that void to fill it, to fill those gaps. And I'm a little challenged by that because I don't see it as necessarily being the answer to one's spiritual quest. It may, and I've seen this occur in my own teaching with students who will say that this helped them within their journey, as you had said, that it may be a means to grow some capabilities, some ways of being that help people in their spiritual journey, whatever that happens to be, even if it's an atheist one, even if it's a one for a different tradition than we find ourselves. And that's one of the reasons that I'm very strident in my insistence about the separation of the historical foundational background of mindfulness movement being in Buddhism. No one is denying that. That is certainly there. In the same way that algebra may have its roots in Islam, but we don't have to become Muslim to do algebra. And I don't think we have to become Buddhists to do these practices as meditations. Science would bear that out. And it can still help you, and this is my key point, it can help you with whatever your spiritual practice may be, if that is interest. It's not the answer to it. It's a means to explore your own answers within your own tradition or changing, but it's not, at least when I teach, there's not a stealth Buddhism involved. And I'm wondering, Toby, if you could just reflect for a bit on your own thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, you reminded me of something, actually. A lovely quote by a guy called Edward Wilson, who said, we're drowning in information, yet we're starving for wisdom, or we're starved of wisdom. This idea that these gaps, we're filling this void with something, whether it be mindfulness, whether it be I have to say, with a lot of teenagers that I work with, sometimes that void is filled with something a lot more risky. And so I kind of come back to that idea of all the various different risks that young people have. To what ends can I address all those risks if it isn't with a kind of philosophical response? Because otherwise you kind of zoom that lens into whatever that issue is. So it might be that the kid's smoking cannabis, or that they're, I don't know, various things. None of which often by themselves are actually that risky. But when you get the sense that a young person is filling that void with something, and teenagers tend to think they're invincible, and they tend to do it to the very max. And, we were teenagers too, right?
Yep. Once upon a time.
So we know about that. But I think what I feel, and this is a slightly convoluted way of answering your question, is that those responses require a kind of discerning mind. And that discernment around, the wisdom that Edward Wilson speaks about, is often that I think it's okay to share the provenance of things with young people. It's totally okay to give someone the kind of the space to explore where mindfulness meditation might come from. Actually, when those explorations happen, young people tend to come back with all kinds of things. They might find, for example, meditation or elements of meditation practice from the Quaker tradition in the Christian faith. They might see Sufism as being a kind of mystical thing that has elements of, and I could go on, we could talk about a number of the world religions that have a kind of contemplative practice within them. I remember a student of mine saying, as we started the unit, "Oh, hang on, I don't think I can do mindfulness. My mum wouldn't like it." And I said, "Well, why is that?" She said, "Well, because we're a Christian family and we can't do Buddhism." And I thought, okay. So I, spoke to the family, and they were undeniably a little bit cautious. But once the conversation had happened, they recognized this as being a tool that the young person could use to support their mental well-being. I heard it beautifully explained to me by a teacher in Bhutan. He said that, just as you would brush your teeth to give you good oral hygiene, so we brush our minds to give our minds good mental hygiene. It's just an exercise. It's a physical exercise that we're doing. There is a void, and there is a way that we fill it. I think all of us do, whether it be with those glasses of wine that we might have in the evening as adults. And I think as long as we're sort of aware and present of those choices, then it doesn't seem to the idea of everything in moderation, right? I think sometimes even meditation in moderation or mindfulness in moderation, there's a world that we want to experience as well. And I don't think that I don't believe it necessarily is a response for all young people. I definitely had kids that I've taught and adults that I've taught who said, "Yeah, we've got mindfulness, understand that. Now let's move on to the next thing. Thanks." They've got it they think they have it in 20 minutes. The sustained practice that I've seen with my own life, and that I've been really privileged and fortunate to see manifest in other people that I know who've done some of the training that we've established. I mean, that's really quite something, isn't it? When you know that that's a space you can go to, there's a sort of a response that you can have, a mindful response that you can have in your daily life, whether it be when you're, washing the dishes or heated discussions with family members, that actually, that is the transformative experience that I think young people can have. And that's really fundamental to why I've pinned a lot of my hope, actually, that this is really beneficial. Now, I suspect it will lead on to, is there such a thing as mindfulness that isn't with values? You interviewed someone recently and spoke about, in your introduction, about the military mindfulness, and how, there's a sort of, growing voice of dissent about the fact that mindfulness can be used by the army.
Yeah, an irrational fear about awareness in the military, as if they are not people who are also deserving of help, of compassion, of awareness, and the ability to discern when not to pull the trigger as well. These are things that are conveniently ignored by the mindful cranks, as they have named themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard them described even more rudely than that. One of my good friends when I grew up was joined the British Army. He's a tank commander in Iraq, and we used to meet in the pub when he came back from his service. And I remember him, he had some pretty harrowing experiences. I think one evening he spoke about we were in our early 20s, but the guys who were with him were late teenagers. These were kids in a very complicated environment, making very adult decisions. And he said, the trouble is, Toby, is that we've got these guys. What we need is people like you in the army. Not because I was a better soldier, but because what they were having to deal with was impacting the rest of the world. Those split second decisions about whether to, as you say, to shoot or not, and the impacts that might have on, well, we see the results, I think, nowadays of quick thinking decisions that perhaps wouldn't it have been wonderful if those young men had been given the kinds of training needs in a mindfulness practice that perhaps would have created a calmer, more sensible response. And that. And it's thousands of years of history of the kind of the conversation between contemplative practice and military practice, right? This isn't something new. I feel that very strongly, and it isn't something that is only a provider for those people who are, esoteric enough to access it.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, please let's not have a kind of hierarchy of needs here on whether you're kind of down enough to be mindful. And anything that I think we try to promote and establish in schools has to be able to meet the needs of the wider community, from the chef who's cooking the kids' meals to the janitor who, if we really believe in trying to make a better world, then it has to be something that can be responded to by all stakeholders in our worlds. And I think that mindfulness has that capacity. I have to say, I think that the work that's happening at Stanford with the Tenjinpa's compassion training stuff, that's really exciting. I'm exploring some of that with colleagues here in the UK. But that mindfulness isn't going to go away, is it? It's going to have a very strong foundation in our thinking. I remember recently I went to a Hindu temple in Neasden in West London, which is a most amazing place. It's a beautiful building, and has a museum at the bottom. And in the museum, there are various kind of little scenes on display. But one of them is a quote from a British historian who said that the world will seek an Indian solution to its problems. This is a guy writing in the 1800s. An Indian solution to the world's problems is what will happen, he predicted, in the future. I thought, that's quite interesting, isn't it? That we've spent a lot of time in our sort of Western worlds exploring our practice and our thinking, and then it's perhaps not exotic enough and not exciting enough.
Yeah, it's interesting to see this. And I think this comes from the becoming more and more a global society, and our digital technology is helping with that in making things immediately accessible to everyone who can get to a computer. So it's not everyone on the planet, but it's a lot more people than it used to be. Yeah. And as the world shrinks more and more, there is an advantage in that if we have the awareness and the courage to explore ideas that are other than those that we were raised with, that we may hold dear, and learn something new, something that may really magnify the positive effects of other things that we already have as an embedded part of how we are in the world. Yeah. That's our opportunity with this, if we have the insight and the courage to take it.
And that's really funny that you mentioned that, because it's one of the things that occurred to me on my master's course, I was going to do a Devanagari Sanskrit course, a part of the master's. It was going to be about 6 hours a week, plus all the learning that had to happen. And after a couple of weeks, I realized that my brain is not wired for Sanskrit. There is no way that I could really get a grip on it. And I also, because it was part-time, I just realized I couldn't give it the time I needed. So I spoke to the guy in charge of the master's program, and he said, well, Tobes, you could do another module. And I said, great, what other Buddhist modules are there? And he said, well, there aren't any other Buddhist modules. You'd have to do essential Christian texts, or core Christian texts. I should get its name right. I thought, really? I'm not really sure that's, what I wanted to do, but nevertheless, I'll give it a go. So I have to tell you that on the master's course, there are not that many people. In fact, on the core Christian texts, there is one other student and me. So we are able to spend an hour and a half a week with some of the leading thinkers and writers and academics on essential core Christian texts. And these people, as you can probably imagine, are some of the most extraordinarily academic and wonderful folk you ever get the chance to meet. Doing a range of different texts, from Dante's Divine Comedy right through to various other old St. Francis of Assisi, a whole range of Christian writings, this rich library of work, which I have more or less rejected throughout my adult life because it was Christian and not exotic enough. But give me a sutta any day and I'd be really excited. I'd love to read a sutta over a Christian text, but I was obliged and thought I'd give it a go. And I've got to tell you that it's been the most revealing experience, because right in front of me is this European narrative of spirituality and contemplation and thinking and ethics and philosophy that has opened my eyes to the landscape, as you say, that's present in our lives. I'm not a Christian, but I wouldn't reject sort of Christian values or ideas. But I haven't ever really kind of gone into that library to explore the work. And it really struck me when we were in Bhutan on this beautiful day. They commissioned in this room these wonderful illustrations of various Buddhas, and they placed them on a tent wall. And the light came up in the afternoon across the Himalayas and lit these up. These Buddhas were sort of illuminated in the most extraordinary way and casting their light onto the ground. And I thought, it was a sort of mystical, almost magical experience. And then it struck me, really, I have spent hours of my life as a young man and in various different kind of walks in churches, looking through the church at the stained glass windows and how the light comes onto the ground. And, I've never thought what a wonderful, magical, mystical experience I'm having. It's only through the lens of Buddhism and that exploration that I'm really think that I'm able now to kind of go and look at Christianity with new eyes. We block things often at our peril. We lose out, don't we? Because we somehow feel that it's, I don't know quite what it is, that it's we've rejected it, or it's somehow boring or archaic, or it doesn't speak to us. Whereas actually, I think there's a whole range of different things that we can explore, and it's that kind of slightly Renaissance mind that I think that we want to install and adhere to in our own practice, but also we want to promote in our young people. It's that kind of journey, that lifelong passion for exploring that is about tolerance. It's not about like restricting our access. It doesn't just have to be, anyway, that's what I'm thinking.
Open curiosity. How do we foster that? Yeah, completely agreed. Toby, I want to segue a little bit into something else that you're doing. You have a podcast. I'm wondering if you could just spend a minute or two and tell us about that.
Right. So, in a former life, I was actually a musician and a guitarist, and I played with bands, and we enjoyed it a lot. And I also DJ'd for various nightclubs and stuff, and I had a bit of a wild time doing it. And then I went into teaching and so on. But as I got older, I realized that I love my DJing stuff, and I have a good, healthy record collection. And I ended up doing some podcasting under the kind of name of the Tin Mine. What I really wanted to do was try to sort of mix music with thinkers, and I actually took spoken word of people like Eckhart Tolle, various other thinkers and speakers, and I kind of fused their spoken word with classical and what's called drone music, and put it together, and I sort of chucked it out into the ether and saw what might come back. And things came back. I was surprised to see that various radio stations and people will say, "Can we play that on our radio shows?" So, it's funny how these things work out. But a radio station in New York, a kind of underground hip hop station, which was the last place I ever thought would be interested. They just sort of found the whole thing so weird and quirky that they asked to play it on their kind of breakfast show on a Sunday morning, which kind of felt like the time when, people might be listening. So I ran the Tin Mine for a few years, and it ended up getting picked up by a couple of stations, one in London, one in New York. And now I'm actually about to launch back into radio in the UK. So I'm going to go on air. I hope all will be revealed soon, to have a new radio show, which will be broadcast on the internet and over the FM dial, which is really exciting.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Glad that happened. For those of you who are interested in following more of what Toby is doing, you can go to his website, www.schoolofmeta.com, and I'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode. Toby, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.